Hi, this is Kalori. Welcome to Scrum and Agile Digest. Let's continue talking about burn down charts.
So, what is a burn down chart? It's the output of your daily Scrum, right? It's going to show you how much amount of work is remaining per sprint, and it's kind of showing if your team is on the right track or not, right? If all the ducks are in a row or not. So, it's a very important visual presentation of how your team is progressing on a day-to-day basis, and it will easily show you if your team is stuck, if there are any impediments, or if there are any risks. So I actually consider it one of the most important metrics of Scrum. It basically will show you the correlation between work that's remaining at any point of time during the sprint and how the team is progressing. So it's basically going to show you daily progress of the sprint. It shows you the remaining work in the sprint backlog, and it's usually measured in story points, right? You can also measure it in hours, right? Hours left in the sprint cycle. You need to visualize the correlation between the work remaining and the progress that the team is doing. So I'll show you in the next a couple of slides basically how we chart out a burn down. You can have on the x-axis a date, on the y-axis you can have the hours of work remaining. So this is just a burn down example, velocity in hours. I think I'm going to come back to this slide after I show you a burn down chart. So this is a typical example of a burn down chart. So basically on the x-axis I'm showing the number of days in a sprint. Let's say it's a two-week sprint, so 10 days. And on the y-axis, I'm showing you the number of hours, right? So you can see here the yellow line is actually called the ideal line, right? So this is, the number of hours that the team committed on day one. That's where it starts from. So let's say it committed 60, in this particular case, somewhere between 50 and 60, let's say it committed 55 hours, right, for the sprint. And the idea is with the burn down that it's going to be a linear line. So every day you're going to burn some hours, and every day your line is going to vertically come down. And by the end of day 10, the number of estimated hours remaining on the sprint should be 0. So that means you started at whatever hours that you committed, let's say 55, you work through the sprint, right? And then you have to come down to 0 hours at the end of the sprint. That is the ideal line. Now, and that's the orange line in this case. The blue line is basically what your team is actually burning down. So, in the beginning, they were at 55 hours, and you can see here it's below the ideal line. Now, the idea is as long as your team's, as long as this actual remaining hours is below the ideal line, it's good. That means that you are burning down more than what the ideal line wants you to burn down, right? So if you're below, you're on track. Once you go above the ideal line, that is a problematic area. That means that you are not burning down enough hours. That shows a problem. That means that there's some of the other issue happening here. There's some of the other impediment due to which you're not able to complete your work. You're not able to burn down as many hours as you need. So it basically will show you that you might be behind schedule. So in this particular burn down, basically it's showing you a burn down chart, it's showing you low risk. Why is it a low risk? Because you are, most of the time till day 6, you are below the ideal line. So you're on track, right? On day 7, you're going above the ideal line because of some reason. So uh, which is a problem. However, because it's day 7, you still have a couple of days to recover, right? And come back to the ideal line or below the ideal line, right? So that's why it's a low risk. If you are above the ideal line towards the end of the sprint, like day 9, or even day 10 means you're pretty much done, but day 9, that's difficult. That you don't have much scope to come back below your ideal line, so that's high risk. So, and there could be multiple reasons. It could just be administrative task. The team members might have forgotten to fill in their hours that they've actually worked. That if that's really the case, it's an easy fix, right? They put in the hours, your line comes below the ideal line, you're back on track. But if there's some other issue the team is stuck on because of which they're not able to progress, that's a problem. That's what you need to deal with, and that's what the burn down chart is showing you clearly. Now, if you look at this chart, here you can see the burn down is actually showing you a very high risk, right? Day 1 all the way to day 6, you were below the ideal line, so you were burning more than you needed to. So it was great. It was a good situation. Day 7 onwards, you started burning much less hours, right? And it goes on above the ideal line. By day 9, you are so far up, right? It's very difficult for you to come back from here. So this is a high risk. You are completely behind the schedule. So a good team or a good scrum master, what they would do is they would look at this line and they will not wait till day 9 to find out if there's a problem, right? At day 6 or 7, you know that there's a problem, or even before that, you know that you're not going to be able to burn as many hours or because of some impediment, some risk. You need to tackle it right at this point, day 6. So you don't let the situation happen, and you are able to come back down the ideal line after day 6, or you tackle the risk, or you let the stakeholders, product owners know, be transparent. So you don't let the burn down go to this stage. That is our ideal situation. Try to tackle it beforehand, and that's why when you look at burn down chart every day, you are basically able to see how you're progressing and what risks you might have, and you can accordingly take some course corrective actions. Another way to look at burn down chart is capacity line. So we have the ideal line, and the dotted line here is the dotted linear line here is the capacity line. If you remember a couple of slides back, we talked about the capacity of the team, right? The capacity line is pretty much that, right? So the capacity line is, we have the ideal line, and we can also chart out the capacity line, that is the capacity of the team to take up story points. Now, in this chart, if you look at it, I have a big problem with the burn down, and it's actually high risk. And why is that? You might say that, hey, my ideal line, the orange line, is here. The actual remaining hours is much above the ideal line, so there's a risk. That is true. You are above the ideal line, so you're burning less hours. But there's another problem here. If you look at the capacity line, not only is your actual remaining hours above the ideal line, it's actually above the capacity line as well. So your team doesn't even have the capacity to finish these stories, right? It doesn't have the capacity of these story points. So the problem here is it's a twofold problem, right? Not only are you above the ideal line, so you have to bring that down. The problem is, how are you going to bring it down when your team doesn't have the capacity to bring it down? So it's a twofold problem here. It's going to be very hard for you to recover in this case because, you are behind schedule and your team doesn't have the capacity to do these stories, right? So if your actual remaining hours was below the capacity line, even if it's above the ideal line, as long as it was below the capacity line, you still give yourself a chance to recover, right? Because you have the capacity, you can, you might have a possibility to recover. In this particular case, it's high risk because not only is it above capacity, above the ideal line, it's above the capacity line. You do not have enough capacity to pull it off, right? So huge risk. Best to be transparent to your stakeholders, product owners, and in your retrospectives when you are for the next sprint when you're planning. Make sure that you chart out your capacity line and basically choose story points according to the capacity of the team. So we looked at some problematic burn down charts, right? So what can be some causes for this? Some causes could be the team is not updating their hours daily. The task estimation was not correct. It's underestimated, or the team maybe has not estimated all the tasks in the user stories. They've not assigned hours to them, or it could be the team is blocked by some impediment and they need to resolve it before the team can proceed. So if these are your problem areas, what action items can you take? So you need to make sure that the team members are updating their hours daily. Try to bring this as Scrum Master. Try to bring this up in all your daily Scrum meetings. Make sure the team members are updating their hours. During sprint planning, take your time to do proper task estimation. Understand the stories properly to give proper time estimates. Add buffer to the user stories. Resolve the impediments when they arise, right? If there are some stories that are blocked, do not, wait for the resolution. Try to work, if possible, on other stories which have been committed, right? Try to determine all dependencies, right? That's why it's very important to have independent stories, if you remember the invest principle. If you have stories which have dependencies, it makes very difficult to basically not only give a time estimate, task estimation, but if you are blocked on some impediment, multiple stories might get blocked. That's why you should try to have independent stories. But if you have any dependencies like resources, software, you can some teams have basically a sprint zero, where if they look at all the dependencies, any resources, infrastructure, software, and they try to resolve it before going into a sprint. I usually don't encourage teams to do that because there is no value add for a sprint zero. I mean, you're not actually showing a minimal viable product at the end of sprint zero, and that's kind of going against the principle of Scrum. However, if some teams, instead of calling it a sprint zero, what you can do is you can take a couple of days before sprint actually starts, a couple of days before your sprint planning, and you can look at the next sprint and you can see if there are any dependencies, and you can take quicker action. If you need some resources software, you can start working on it at that point itself before the sprint starts, and before the stories are committed, and that will give you a better picture, and you won't get stuck in the sprint trying to resolve the issues. The other thing, could be, sometimes if your ideal line, let's say, says that by day 10, let's say it's a sprint, 10 days, day 10, you should be having 0 hours. Let's say if you've undercommitted, right? Or overestimated the stories, what might happen is that you might finish up the stories much earlier, than day 10, right? So you might be at 0 hours in day 7 or day 8. Of course, it's less risky, but again, it's not the ideal situation because your team obviously had more capacity to deliver more stories, but instead you undercommitted, right? So you basically committed less than your capacity, or your team might have worked aggressively, burned few hours, so you finished up much quicker, right? So the best is in the next sprints, you groom the stories better so that the requirements are clear, and the team can estimate the stories better. If the team is always trying to is always finishing up earlier, that means that they're undercommitting. Give them more stories. You want to have the full capacity of the team involved. Effect of scope creep. If you look at this burn down, right? This is a very less risky burn down, right? Your team has always been below the ideal line, so you can definitely take up more additional work because you have more capacity to catch up. So in this case, if you have scope creep, it shouldn't be a big issue. In this particular case, again, I've drawn the capacity line here. You are already, if you look at the blue line, right, you're already trending above the ideal line. So you are actually, even with the current scope, you are at a risk of completing the sprint, right? So it's not a good idea to accept new user stories at this point. So if there's going to be scope creep, the Scrum Master can go talk to the product owner or the stakeholder and say, hey, look, this is my situation right now. I don't think the team is ready to take up any more stories. So, look how beautiful the burn down chart is, right? Not only is it helping you determine if there's any risks or problems with the sprint, it can also look at the scope creep situation. It can see if you have the capacity to accept more stories or not, and you can give a better picture to your product owner instead of just saying yes to everything the product owner says and accepting all the stories blindly. You now have a graphical representation, a tool in your favor, which will tell you that if you should be accepting more stories or not. So yeah, in this case, it's not a good situation. Although you're below your capacity line, because you're above your ideal line, it's not a good. It's not good for you to accept stories at this point. You won't even finish. This is Dwight. Like I told you, this is one of my favorite shows. Office. So this is Dwight saying, "Scrum Master, I need to work harder on my burn down." This is one of the episodes where the office actually in the office there was a burn down scene, and I think Dwight was pretty happy because it wasn't him; somebody else was involved in it. All right, so a burn down chart showing sudden spikes. What does that mean? So look at this burn down, right? You started off with below the ideal line, so you're doing very well. Suddenly, on day 4, you went above the ideal line, you stayed there for a little while, and then you came down again around day 7, you went below the ideal line, and again you shot up. Right? So, what does the spike mean? Right? So, the possible causes could be there might be a change in scope, right? You probably, the team members may not have put in the hours properly. So, once they put in the hours, your actual remaining hours went down. That could be one thing. Or you might have added more scope, and that's why the team is not able to catch up, and the line went up. Or it could be that the team re-estimated the tasks, whatever tasks that they had committed to. They thought that's not the right number of hours they need. They re-estimated the tasks and they increased more tasks or they added more hours to their tasks. Again, not a good practice. So what are the action items? You need to avoid changes in scope. Once the sprint kicks off, try not to have changes in scope. You need to continuously groom the backlog to have a healthy backlog. So you don't have a situation where you're adding more hours to your task or adding more tasks to the new story. This should be done at the sprint planning level, not during the sprint. So you need to estimate your tasks properly so that you don't need a re-estimation. So when it comes to burn down, right, on the y-axis, there are some teams which like to do story points. There are some teams which like to do hours remaining. I personally prefer hours remaining, and I'll tell you why. So what happens is with story points, unlike hours, right, where you can see the progress every day, with story points you cannot see the progress every day, right? Because you will only see the progress in story points when a story is accepted, right? So a story usually a story may not be accepted in one day, right? It might take 2 or 3 days for you to accept a story. So you won't see any progress on story points for 2-3 days till a story is accepted, right? So I feel that's a disadvantage. You're not getting a clear picture. However, if you use hours on the y-axis instead of story points, you can basically see on a daily basis how you're burning down the hours. I think it gives you a better picture. With story points, it's either complete or it's not complete. It's nothing in between, right? So even if with the story points, even if the team has worked on it, they've burned some hours, if you're using story points, you won't get that picture, right? It won't show that your team is actually working on anything. But if you're using hours, it will show a clear progress, right, that the team is working on. So that's the reason that in the burn down, I like to see hours on the y-axis. But again, it totally depends on you. If the story point is something that you want to see, or that's the that's where your product owner or your team is more interested in, by all means you can use story points. But the idea is whether you use in story points or hours, the burn down basically should give you a good metric of how your team is progressing over a period of time throughout the sprint. Incomplete stories, right? So what happens if a team has committed some user stories but they've not finished them in time, right? The thing is, because sprint is time boxed, if you remember the inverted iron triangle, the timeline of the sprint cannot be extended. So what you have to do is, if the leftover story, it has to go back to the product backlog and it has to be prioritized in the future, right, for a future sprint, right? But try to avoid this. Try to make sure that your commitment, whatever you've committed, you should be able to finish, because that is a good sign of a maturity in a good team. And that's what Scrum wants the teams to do. Have minimum incomplete stories. Of course, there are some times when you can't avoid it. You have to have incomplete stories. It's fine. As long as the product owner agrees to it, you're transparent about it, you move it back to the product backlog, so it gets reprioritized in the future. But the best practice is do not demo it. Do not demo an incomplete story during sprint demo. Just like we have burn down for sprints, we can also have a release burn down. It's very similar. It's basically going to show you the amount of work that is left to complete in a particular release. Now, what is a release? A release will have these small iterations, right? The sprint iterations. So one release can have 10 iterations. It's the same concept. It will basically start with the total number of story points or hours that were committed for a particular release. And for every sprint, you can see how much is the team velocity, how much work is remaining, how much work has been done so far. So the only difference between a release burn down and a regular burn down chart is a release burn down will span across multiple iterations, right? Whereas um, uh, sprint burn down will be only for one single sprint. And just like you have a release burn down, you can also have a release burn up, right? Same concept, it will show you the total amount of work that's been completed in the release so far. So in the release burn down, again, same thing, you can see if you're behind schedule or you're ahead of schedule. So same concept, right? The to-do line is the blue line here and the done line is the orange line. So I'm measuring on story points on y-axis and x-axis is my sprints. So if I am above the to-do, if my to-do line is above the done line, I'm obviously behind schedule. I'm not finishing as much story points as I should. If I am below the done line, if my to-do line is below the done line, means I'm ahead of schedule. I am doing I'm finishing up a lot of story points. So a release burn down is also good graphical representation of how your team is progressing. Scrum dashboard, we already saw this before, but this is kind of an example of Scrum dashboard, that you can, this is from Jira. So you can basically see how you're progressing on every story, right? So basically which stories are in the to-do list, which stories are in progress, which stories are in done. You can show this in your daily scrums along with your burn down charts. Alright, this is a question that gets asked a lot. Can you cancel a sprint? Now, yes, you can. Should you do it? You shouldn't do it though. So, you can cancel a sprint under extraordinary circumstances, right? So let's say the demand for the product has changed, right? The market conditions have changed. You might have to cancel a sprint. You don't have a way out. However, it's best not to cancel a sprint. Okay, try to avoid it as the plague. Don't cancel a sprint if you can. Only the product owner can cancel the sprint under the influence of the the Scrum Master, the team, or the stakeholders. But again, run away from it. If you're trying to cancel a sprint, run away from that situation. Do not cancel a sprint if you can. So again, if you have zombie projects, if you've cancelled a sprint, when do you cancel a sprint? The sprint becomes obsolete. The goals, the strategy of the organization has changed. There's a new change in technology or market condition. Customer demand has changed. The shippable stories cannot be accepted. Under these situations, you cancel a sprint. If you've done some completed or done stories for the sprint, you probably want to review it with your product owner and see if it can be accepted. For some future sprint, and any incomplete stories will basically go back to the product backlog and need to be re-estimated in the future. Let's come to the next sprint ceremony, which is the sprint review meeting or the sprint demo meeting. So what are we doing here? So sprint review meeting basically is the demo meeting, right? Here we will demo our minimal viable product, whatever product that we worked on. It should be an informal meeting. You can have the product owner, Scrum Master, and the team. The team has to be there. It's non-negotiable. What you have to do is you demo the incremental minimum viable product here, the MVP. You have to show you've done whatever basically you had agreed on initially, the acceptance criteria. You have to show the done product. It can be, again, it's time boxed. It can be a 4-hour meeting if it's a big sprint, like a 1-month sprint. If it's a shorter sprint, you can have a shorter meeting. So for shorter sprints, the event is usually shorter. So what you want to see here is, did the team actually achieve the sprint goal, right? You have to show your completed stories from the sprint backlog, and you can also share the journey of the finished sprint with your stakeholders, with your product owners. You show the minimum viable product to try to get a sign off from them, right? So these are mainly the 3 steps that you will do in the sprint demo. So first is you show your MVP. You want to get your product owner's feedback or sign off. You can also look at the decide on what to do next means. You can also look at the next user stories. You can line them up for the next sprint where the product owner is there. And you can also discuss the roadmap with the product owner. Hopefully they have a prioritized backlog for you by then. And you can pick and choose which stories. You can get a head start on your sprint planning meeting, right? And you can see which stories you need to work on for the next sprint. So we already spoke about this. The team will demonstrate the minimum viable product. They will show what they accomplished during the sprint. It's informal. You can have 2 to 4 hours. The whole team has to participate and the stakeholder has to sign off. So, how do you make this a successful meeting, right? You need to speak the language of the stakeholders. You show them the business value, right? That's what they're concerned with. They want to know how much ROI, return on investment, they're getting out of this product. So speak their language. If you are very technical, your stakeholder may not be very technical, right? So if you talk about the joins in your database or how you cleaned up the database, they may not be very interested in that, right? They might be more interested in how many more customers you're getting on board because of this change you made, how it's going to help the customer, how much profit it's going to bring to the organization. So speak the language of your stakeholders. That will make them happy. Practice. Why not? That is the formula for success for everything, right? The more you go into these meetings, the more you will understand the stakeholder, understand what their expectations are, and you can speak to what they would like. Keep it short, right? Tell a story. Tell a story about your journey during the sprint, how you did it, what impediments, if any, you faced, how you overcame, how you worked together as a team, how you delivered this. A stakeholder or a product owner would be interested in knowing how your sprint went, rather than just showing him, hey, this is a finished product, this is what we did. Make it a likable story, right? It's always a nice way to do it. Some teams like to pre-record their demos. It's useful, especially if you're showing a software demo. Let's say you're writing out code. You're always the technology can work for you, it can work against you. So always the computer, the infrastructure may not always cooperate. Sometimes you might lose power, things like that. So it shows. Although you might have a good finished product, if you're not able to show it properly, it's not in the best interest of the team. So you can always pre-record it and showcase it to your product owners. It's totally acceptable instead of doing everything live. And try to be transparent, right? Try to make sure whatever the product owner asked for, whatever you committed, you should be able to produce that. You should be able to provide that to your stakeholders. So be transparent, and if you follow these, you should be easily be able to get your product on the sign off. All right. The last ceremony in Scrum is the sprint retrospective.